My name is Audra. I am 34 years old, and just 3 days after burying my husband Nathaniel, I found myself standing in a crowded backyard for my nephew Lucas' first birthday party. My mother Brenda and my father Harrison had practically dragged me there, insisting that family comes first. But as I stood near the patio, trying to hold back my tears, my sister Sierra tapped her champagne glass to silence the crowd. With fake tears streaming down her perfect face, she announced to everyone that her son was actually Nathaniel Child. She claimed they had a secret affair, and then she pulled out a typed will. She looked me dead in the eyes and demanded half of my $8 million mansion as inheritance for his supposed bloodline. I did not scream or cry. I just looked at the piece of paper, smiled coldly, and said, "Oh, I see." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud, because I knew a medical secret about my late husband that made her entire story a biological impossibility before. I tell you exactly how I let my greedy sister dig her own grave. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe. If you have ever had to protect your peace from a toxic family, you will want to hear what happened next. The silence in the backyard was deafening. The gentle breeze rustled the blue birthday streamers, but nobody dared to breathe. I watched as Sierra wiped a perfectly timed tear from her cheek, holding that fraudulent piece of paper, like a winning lottery ticket. Nathaniel was a high school history teacher who loved his students and loved our life together. He had died suddenly from an aneurysm just weeks after his 35th birthday. My heart was still shattered into a million pieces. Yet here was my younger sister, 30 years old and always the golden child, using my tragedy as a stage performance to steal my property. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her lie, my parents leaped into action. They did not rush to comfort the daughter who had just become a widow. They did not ask if I was all right. Instead, my mother, Brenda, marched right past me and wrapped her arms around Sierra. My father, Harrison, stepped forward with his chest puffed out, putting on his best authoritative voice. He looked at me with the exact same look of disappointment he had used to control my entire life. "Audra, you need to be reasonable about this," my father announced loudly enough for all the guests to hear. "We know you are grieving, but Nathaniel has a son. You cannot just hoard that massive house all to yourself. You have to do the right thing for his bloodline." My mother nodded vigorously, rubbing Sierra back. "You have always been so selfish with your wealth, Audra. You stage those luxurious multi-million-dollar mansions for your corporate clients, and you live like a queen while your sister struggles. It is only fair that Lucas gets what his father wanted him to have. Do not make this a legal battle. Just sign the deed over." The sheer entitlement made my blood boil, but I maintained my icy composure. I looked past my delusional parents and locked eyes with DeAndre. He was Sierra's hardworking husband, a 32-year-old restaurant manager who had always treated me with genuine kindness. DeAndre stood frozen near the barbecue grill. The paper plate he had been holding slipped from his hands and crashed onto the patio. Baked beans and potato salad splattered across his shoes, but he did not even flinch. His dark brown eyes were wide with sheer devastation. He was an honest African-American man who worked 60-hour weeks to provide for a child he believed was his own. Now his wife was standing in front of their friends and neighbors, publicly declaring she had slept with her dead brother-in-law. DeAndre Sierra started reaching a hand out toward him, but her voice lacked any real remorse. "I am so sorry you had to find out this way." DeAndre did not say a word. He stepped back from her touch, shaking his head in absolute disgust. Sierra let out a dramatic sob, playing the victim perfectly. "See what you made me do," she wailed, pointing an accusing finger at me. "My marriage is ruined because you would not just quietly share your wealth." I took a step forward, and the entire crowd seemed to brace for an explosion. But I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I had spent my entire life being the responsible scapegoat. Now they wanted my house. I reached out and plucked the typed will right from Sierra, trembling hand. The paper felt cheap. I scanned the text quickly. It was riddled with 10 basic formatting errors. Nathaniel was the most meticulous man I had ever known. He would never draft a legal document that looked like a high school homework assignment, but the real joke was the demand itself. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my designer purse. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention today, Sierra," I said, my voice perfectly level. "It is incredibly enlightening." My father scoffed. "We expect you to hand over the keys soon." I looked at him, feeling the very last thread of my loyalty snap completely. "You are right, Dad," I replied smoothly, turning away from them. "But you people are just strangers who happen to share my DNA. Do not call me. If any of you step foot on my property again, I will have you arrested for trespassing." As I gripped the steering wheel and drove away from that wretched party, I smiled, knowing I held the weapon to destroy their arrogant lives forever. I had just pulled my car into the immaculate driveway of my estate, the iron gates closing securely behind me, when I saw a familiar truck speeding down the avenue. It was DeAndre. He had left the party, abruptly leaving his unfaithful wife behind to deal with the mess she created. His hands must have been gripping the steering wheel with the same crushing betrayal I had felt when I lost Nathaniel. But my grief was born of a tragic medical event, while his was born of a vicious, calculated lie. I stepped into my silent home. The massive crystal chandelier cast a cold, bright light over the empty foyer. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I walked into my home office, locked the heavy wooden doors, and waited. I knew my family. I knew they would not let this go quietly. They needed a villain to fund their lazy lifestyle, and they had just elected me to play the part. The explosion took exactly 48 hours to detonate. On Tuesday morning, my phone began vibrating violently against the kitchen counter. Notifications poured in faster than my eyes could track them. Pings from Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn flooded my locked screen. I opened the first link sent by a concerned colleague. Sierra had not just played the victim in private. She had gone completely nuclear. She had posted a highly edited, heavily filtered video of herself sitting on the floor of her cramped living room clutching little Lucas to her chest. She wept beautifully for the camera. She claimed that Nathaniel had been the love of her life. She painted a tragic, completely fabricated picture of star-crossed lovers kept apart by duty. Then she dropped the real poison. She called me a barren, heartless widow. She told the internet that because my own womb was empty, my heart had turned to stone. She claimed I was deliberately hiding Nathaniel assets and trying to throw my own flesh and blood nephew out onto the streets to starve. Directly below the video was a link to a GoFundMe campaign titled, "Help a Fatherless Child Survive His Cruel Aunt." The campaign had already raised $15,000 from gullible strangers. My parents had immediately shared the post. My mother, Brenda, wrote a lengthy caption detailing how she had failed to raise me with proper Christian values. My father, Harrison, commented that he was utterly ashamed to share my last name and begged his powerful business connections to donate to Sierra. I scrolled through the comments feeling a surreal mix of disgust and fascination. Strangers were calling me a monster. Local community groups shared the video demanding justice for the poor single mother. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was suffocating. I decided to drop a single comment to provide some much-needed context to the digital mob. I typed out the harsh reality of our family dynamic. I reminded everyone reading that I had been the sole financial backbone of the family for a decade. I asked my mother if she remembered the $30,000 I paid to clear Sierra credit card debt when she faced bankruptcy. I asked my father if he recalled how I bought Sierra her first car after she totaled his while driving under the influence. I pointed out that Sierra was continuously coddled, shielded from consequences, and bailed out of every single mistake she ever made while I built my luxury staging business from the ground up with zero help. I hit send. It was a massive mistake. The internet does not care about logic or financial receipts when they have a crying mother holding an innocent baby to pity. My comment only poured gasoline on the fire. They accused me of gaslighting my sister, of using my massive wealth to bully a vulnerable woman. The narrative spun entirely out of my control. The real nightmare began the following morning. I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, determined to maintain my professional routine. Aura Staging, LLC, was currently handling the interior design for 3 major penthouses downtown, and I had a staff of 20 people depending on my leadership. I drove my car toward the corporate plaza, but as I turned the corner, my heart sank into my stomach. A crowd of about 40 people had gathered on the sidewalk directly outside the glass doors of my corporate office. They were holding up handmade cardboard signs. Justice for Lucas. Share the wealth. Boycott Aura Staging. Sierra had tagged my business page in her latest post, and her mob of online defenders had mobilized into the real world. I parked in the underground secure garage and took the private elevator up to my floor. My receptionist looked completely panicked. The phones were ringing off the hook. Clients were calling demanding to know why there was an angry protest outside the building. Two high-profile real estate developers emailed me directly expressing deep concern over the negative public relations. In the luxury staging business, reputation is everything. My parents and my sister knew exactly what they were doing. They were hitting my livelihood to starve me out. They wanted to make me so desperate and so universally hated that I would simply sign over the deed to the $8 million house just to make the nightmare stop. They thought they could break me with public shame. They assumed because I had always been the responsible, quiet daughter who dutifully paid their bills and absorbed their insults that I would eventually fold under the pressure of a public scandal. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, looking down at the angry protesters swarming the pavement below. They chanted slogans demanding I give up my wealth to a child that did not even belong to my husband. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Harrison. The message read, "Sign the house over Audra. We can call off these people today. Do not ruin your precious company over your stubborn pride. Do the right thing for Nathaniel's son." I stared at the glowing screen. They really believed they had me trapped. They believed that public humiliation and the threat of losing my corporate clients would force my hand. I locked my phone and placed it on my desk. Let them protest. Let them scream. They were playing checkers while I was setting up a completely different game entirely. I turned away from this glass window, leaving the sight of the chanting mob behind me. I walked back to my mahogany desk to review the morning reports, but a sharp knock interrupted my focus. My receptionist stepped into the office looking even more flustered than before. She apologized and stepped aside, revealing a tall man in a cheap gray suit holding a thick manila envelope. He did not ask for permission to enter. He simply walked straight up to my desk and dropped the heavy envelope right on top of my keyboard. "You are served," he announced flatly, turning on his heel and walking out just as quickly as he had appeared. I stared at the envelope. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I picked it up and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. The header on the first page immediately caught my attention. It bore the logo of the most notoriously aggressive probate litigation firm in the city. They were the kind of lawyers who thrived on tearing families apart for a percentage of the settlement. Sierra and my parents had not just hired any attorney to bully me. They had hired a shark. I flipped through the pages reading the legal jargon with growing disbelief. Sierra had officially submitted the forged will to the court, but she had not stopped there. Attached to the probate filing was an emergency injunction signed by a judge just hours ago. I read the order twice to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. The injunction mandated an immediate and temporary freeze on all of my personal bank accounts. Every dollar I had in my checking and savings was completely locked down. I could not withdraw a single cent to buy a cup of coffee, let alone pay my corporate staff. The legal chokehold tightened as I reached the third page. The court had also granted a temporary lien against my $8 million mansion. The property was legally frozen. I could not sell it, transfer it, or leverage it until the probate investigation concluded. Sierra had claimed that she and her son were at imminent risk of homelessness, and that I was a flight risk who might liquidate Nathaniel's supposed assets to hide the money. The judge acting on the fabricated sob story had granted the emergency freeze. I sat down heavily in my leather chair. The sheer audacity of the attack was staggering. They had weaponized the justice system against me based entirely on a cheap lie. They wanted to paralyze me financially so I could not fight back. They wanted me to feel the walls closing in until the pressure became absolutely unbearable. I looked at the frozen accounts on my laptop screen. My personal funds were completely inaccessible. For a fleeting second, a wave of genuine panic threatened to wash over me. Then my private office line rang. The caller identification displayed my father number. I took a deep breath, smoothing my expression, even though he could not see me. I picked up the receiver and brought it to my ear without saying a word. "Audra, my father." Harrison spoke, his voice practically dripping with smug satisfaction. "I assume you have received the delivery from our legal representatives by now." I remained silent, letting him fill the quiet space with his arrogance. "You left us no choice, Audra," he continued, sounding like a disappointed principal, reprimanding a stubborn student. "We tried to handle this internally like a family. But you had to be difficult. You had to cause a scene at the birthday party and disrespect your sister. Now the courts are involved. Your personal money is gone. Your house is locked down. You are completely cornered and you have absolutely no way out of this mess." I stared at the legal documents on my desk, listening to the man who was supposed to protect me actively participating in my destruction. "What exactly do you want, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly hollow and defeated. I needed him to believe that his aggressive strategy was working. "We want what is fair," Harrison replied quickly. "We want you to sign the deed of the house over to Sierra today. If you stop being so stubborn and just transfer the property to Nathaniel Bloodline, we will call off the lawyers. We will drop the injunction immediately. We will even go out there and tell those protesters that it was all a big misunderstanding. We are willing to forgive you for your hostility, Audra. We just want peace for the baby." The word forgive echoed in my ear. They were offering to forgive me for surviving their vicious smear campaign and their illegal extortion. They wanted to steal an $8 million asset and then have me thank them for letting me keep the rest of my life intact. It was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. "You really think this is going to work?" I asked, my tone dropping an octave. "You think freezing my personal checking account is going to break me? You cannot fight us without money, Audra," my father countered, his tone hardening. "You cannot pay a legal team to drag this out in court when your accounts are frozen. The house is locked. The public hates you. Your corporate clients are going to drop you by the end of the week when they see the news. You are entirely alone. Sign the paperwork and this all goes away. Do the right thing before you lose your business too." I looked out the window at the protesters still marching on the pavement below. I looked at the injunction freezing my personal assets. My father was right about one thing. They had backed me into a corner. But what he completely failed to realize was that cornering a predator only makes it infinitely more dangerous. "I will carefully review the documents you sent," I said, injecting just enough hesitation into my voice to make him think I was finally cracking. "I need time to think about my options." "Do not take too long, Audra," my father warned triumphantly. "The longer you wait, the worse this gets for you. We expect your signature by tomorrow." He hung up the phone. The line went dead. I slowly placed the receiver back onto the cradle. The walls of my office felt tight, and the weight of their betrayal was heavy, but I did not feel defeated. I felt a cold, sharp clarity taking over my entire mind. They thought they had cut off my air supply. They thought I was just a grieving widow who would crumble under the threat of poverty and public shame. I neatly stacked the legal documents on the edge of my desk. I pulled out my corporate secure phone, leaving my frozen personal accounts exactly as they were. The game had escalated beyond simple family drama. This was now a war of survival. I gathered my things and prepared to leave the office through the private exit. I needed to go back to the mansion and prepare for the night ahead. I knew I had to act fast, but I also knew I could not make my next move during the day while they were watching my every step. I drove home in absolute silence, waiting for the cover of darkness to fall. I did not know that a knock on my door at 2 a.m. would soon hand me the exact key I needed to destroy them all. The rain began to fall shortly after midnight, pounding relentlessly against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my living room. I was wide awake, sitting alone in the dark, wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket, and staring at the faint shadows dancing across the hardwood floor. The digital clock on the kitchen oven glowed a harsh green, reading exactly 2 a.m. My mind was racing, analyzing every possible legal maneuver my corporate lawyers could deploy at dawn to fight the injunction. The sudden, sharp buzzing of the front gate intercom shattered the dead silence of the empty house, making me jump. I walked over and checked the security tablet mounted on the wall. Through the grainy night vision camera, I saw a solitary figure standing in the torrential downpour. It was DeAndre. He was drenched to the bone, shivering in a light jacket, and clutching a dark canvas duffel bag tightly to his chest. I did not hesitate for even a second. I pressed the button to unlock the heavy iron gate and walked quickly to the front door, pulling it open just as he reached the covered porch. He stepped into the warm, brightly lit foyer, leaving a heavy trail of rainwater across the imported marble tiles. He looked completely shattered. The strong, proud man who managed a high-end restaurant and worked relentlessly to provide for his family was entirely gone. In his place stood a hollowed-out shell of a human being. His eyes were red and severely swollen, carrying the unmistakable weight of profound betrayal. He dropped the wet duffel bag onto the floor with a heavy thud. It contained his entire life packed hurriedly in the middle of the night. I brought him a dry towel and poured him a tall glass of bourbon. We sat across from each other at the massive quartz kitchen island in complete silence for a very long time. The sound of the violent thunderstorm outside perfectly mirrored the emotional chaos raging within both of us. We were two innocent people drowning in two very different kinds of grief. I was deeply mourning the sudden tragic death of the man I loved, while he was mourning the sudden violent death of the life he thought he had. "I could not stay in that house, Audra," he finally whispered, his voice raspy and totally exhausted. She was sleeping soundly in the master bedroom like she had not just destroyed everything we built. I packed my bag and left. But before I walked out the front door, I did something I have never done before in my entire life. I violated her privacy. He reached into his damp jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone, placing it flat on the pristine white counter. He slid the glowing phone across the smooth surface toward me. "I know Sierra better than anyone else does," DeAndre explained, staring blankly at the glass of amber liquid in his shaking hands. I knew she was hiding something else beneath her public tears. She always uses the exact same password for everything, so I logged into her iCloud account from my laptop. I bypassed her security and went straight to her recently deleted messages folder. She thought she wiped the evidence completely clean, but she is not nearly as smart as she thinks she is. I picked up the phone and began reading the recovered text messages between Sierra and her two closest friends. The timestamp on the first conversation was from 3 weeks ago, just 2 days after my husband suffered his fatal aneurysm. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot as I read my sister's words. Sierra had not confessed to an affair out of overwhelming guilt or a desire for the truth. She had meticulously orchestrated a hostile financial takeover. The text messages detailed her exact legal strategy step by step. She told her friends she desperately needed a massive payout to escape her hidden credit card debt before her creditors sued her. She explicitly stated that Nathaniel being dead was the perfect opportunity because a corpse cannot request a paternity test. She outlined her entire plan to forge the will and ambush me at the birthday party, specifically to maximize public humiliation and force a quick financial settlement out of court. "They were laughing about it, Audra," DeAndre said, his voice breaking slightly before hardening into pure, unfiltered anger. "They were making sick jokes about how rich she was going to be once you surrendered the property. She used a dead man to secure a payday, and she used my innocent son as the ultimate bargaining chip." I kept scrolling through the damning messages. The sheer, calculated malice was genuinely breathtaking, but there was another deeper layer to the conversation that immediately caught my attention. In one text, her friend asked if Sierra was worried about a court-ordered DNA test exposing the lie. Sierra responded with a laughing, crying emoji and typed out that she would simply refuse the test to protect her baby from trauma until I signed the house over, because by then it would not matter who the father was. I set the phone down gently and looked directly at DeAndre. He met my gaze with a fierce, unwavering intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "I already know Lucas is not my biological son," DeAndre stated, his tone dangerously calm and terrifyingly steady. "I have had my suspicions for several months because the timeline of her pregnancy never fully made sense, but I ignored all the glaring red flags because I loved that little boy unconditionally. But reading those deleted messages tonight confirmed something else for me. I am absolutely certain the boy is not Nathaniel's child either." He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the counter. "She is far too sloppy, Audra. She is far too desperate. She picked your husband because he was incredibly wealthy and because he was permanently gone. She fabricated this entire narrative out of thin air to steal your assets. We just need to find out who the real father is to blow her story completely out of the water." The air in the kitchen suddenly shifted. The heavy, suffocating pressure of my parents' extortion and the vicious public smear campaign suddenly felt completely irrelevant. I was no longer a helpless victim waiting for the next legal blow to land. I had a credible witness. I had concrete digital evidence of premeditated financial fraud. And most importantly, I had an ally who was just as intensely motivated to see Sierra face the brutal consequences of her monstrous greed. I looked at the exhausted man sitting across from me. He had lost his marriage, his home, and the child he thought was his own, all in the brutal span of 48 hours. Sierra and my parents had vastly underestimated the massive collateral damage of their greedy scheme. They assumed DeAndre would just disappear quietly into the background, too ashamed of his wife's public infidelity to ever fight back. They assumed I would simply crumble under the suffocating weight of an aggressive legal injunction and social media hate. They were completely entirely wrong. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his. We did not need to sign a legal contract. We did not need to make any grand dramatic declarations. In the quiet darkness of the early morning, surrounded by the relentless pounding of the rain, we formed a silent, ironclad pact. We were going to dismantle their arrogant lives piece by piece. We were going to expose every single lie, every forged document, and every ounce of illegal extortion to the harsh, unyielding light of day. They wanted to wage a war over an $8 million estate. We were going to give them an absolute massacre. Tomorrow morning, we start digging. I told him, my voice turning cold and perfectly steady. You can stay in the guest house for as long as you need to, but right now we need to plan our next move. They think they have me backed into an inescapable corner with frozen bank accounts and a fake lawsuit. But I have a secret of my own, DeAndre. A major medical secret about Nathaniel that Sierra could not possibly have known when she picked him as her target. DeAndre looked up, his dark eyes sharpening with intense, renewed focus. He nodded slowly, bracing himself for the fight ahead. "Let us burn their house down," he said. DeAndre did not just bring deleted text messages to my house that night. He reached down into his damp duffel bag and pulled out a small crumpled piece of paper, smoothing it flat against the quartz countertop. It was a digital receipt from a highly reputable private genetics laboratory. I looked at the receipt and then back up at his exhausted face, trying to comprehend what he had done in the frantic moments before fleeing his broken home. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling heavily as he explained his final move, before walking out on Sierra forever. Before I left the house, I went into the nursery. DeAndre said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas was fast asleep in his crib, hugging that little stuffed bear I bought him for his birthday. It broke my heart into a million pieces, Audra. It took every ounce of strength I had not to just break down and cry right there in the dark. But I knew I could not leave without securing the absolute truth. I used a sterile cotton swab from the bathroom, and I took a DNA sample from the inside of his cheek. He tapped the digital receipt on the counter with a heavy finger. I packed the sample, sealed it perfectly, and dropped it into a priority overnight shipping box at the 24-hour post office on my way here. I paid for the most expensive expedited testing they offer. They will compare his DNA to mine and run it through a massive global ancestry database. In less than 72 hours, I will have legally admissible proof that the boy is not mine, and we might just find out who the real father actually is. I stared at him in complete awe. In the absolute worst moment of his entire life, while his heart was actively being ripped out of his chest, DeAndre had the profound mental clarity to secure biological evidence. He was not just a victim crying in the dark. He was a man meticulously building an airtight legal case against the woman who destroyed him. His proactive brilliance gave me the final push I needed. It was time to hand him the missing piece of the puzzle. It was time to reveal the secret I had been guarding fiercely since the day I married Nathaniel. I stood up from the kitchen stool without saying a word and walked down the long, dark hallway toward my private study. I approached the heavy steel floor safe, hidden behind a bookshelf in the corner of the room. I typed in the secure passcode, turning the heavy metal dial until it clicked open. I reached into the very back of the safe, bypassing my corporate documents and luxury real estate deeds. I pulled out a single thin manila folder. It was old, its edges slightly frayed from years of being carefully hidden away. I walked back into the kitchen and dropped the folder right on top of DeAndre's digital laboratory receipt. He looked at the blank cover and then looked up at me with a confused expression. "You are about to pay a lot of money to a genetics lab to prove that Nathaniel is not the father of your wife." "Baby," I said, my voice completely steady. "But you do not need to do that, DeAndre. I can save you the anxiety of wondering if my husband ever betrayed you. I already know for an absolute medical fact that Sierra is lying." I opened the folder and slid the top document toward him. It was a certified medical report from a prominent fertility specialist, heavily stamped and signed by 3 different physicians. When Nathaniel was 18 years old, he contracted a terrifyingly severe case of the mumps. I explained, watching DeAndre's eyes scan the dense medical terminology. It was so bad he was hospitalized for over a week with a dangerously high fever. The virus caused massive internal complications. It completely, permanently destroyed his reproductive system. Before we even got engaged, Nathaniel sat me down and cried for hours. He told me he was diagnosed as 100% irreversibly sterile. He could never biologically father a child. DeAndre froze. He stopped breathing for a solid 5 seconds. He read the highlighted conclusion at the bottom of the medical document, and then read it a second time just to make sure his exhausted mind was not playing tricks on him. The paper clearly stated 0 viable sperm count and permanent untreatable sterility. "We never told a single living soul," I continued, leaning closer to him. "You know how my parents are. My father, Harrison, is obsessed with bloodlines and legacy and leaving a mark on the world. My mother, Brenda, would have endlessly gossiped about it at her country club brunches. They would have constantly belittled Nathaniel and treated him like he was less of a man just because he could not give them a biological grandchild. We wanted to protect our peace, so we buried the medical records and simply told everyone we were focusing on our careers instead of having kids." DeAndre slowly pushed the file back toward me. A dark, incredibly satisfying smile began to form on his face, replacing the hollow devastation that had consumed him just an hour ago. She did not know he whispered, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Sierra had absolutely no idea. She just picked Nathaniel because he was a wealthy, successful man who happened to die suddenly. She figured a dead man could not demand a paternity test. She saw your $8 million estate sitting there and assumed she could just fabricate a scandalous affair to extort you. She built an entire legal strategy on a biological impossibility. Exactly, I replied, feeling the cold rush of absolute victory coursing through my veins. Sierra forged a legal will and filed a hostile injunction to claim an inheritance for a baby that physically cannot exist. She has committed multiple felonies based on a lie that we can instantly destroy with one piece of paper from this folder. We could go to the police right now and end this entire charade by sunrise, but we are not going to do that, DeAndre stated, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous, predatory focus. If we show our hand right now, she will just claim it was a desperate mistake. She will play the victim again and say she was just confused about who the father was. Your parents will probably hire her a massive legal team to plead temporary insanity and protect their precious golden child from going to prison. We cannot let them off the hook that easily, Audra. We cannot just win the battle. We have to completely annihilate them. He was absolutely right. Sierra was a master manipulator, and my parents were her willing accomplices. If we gave them any room to pivot, they would find a way to wriggle out of the consequences. We needed to corner them completely with no avenue of escape. So what is our strategy? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We wait. DeAndre said, his voice hardening into solid steel. We let your parents continue their vicious smear campaign. We let Sierra go on social media and collect thousands of dollars in fraudulent donations. We let them think they have you completely trapped with their legal injunction. We let them get so wildly arrogant and so deeply committed to this massive fraud that there is no turning back. And we wait for my expedited DNA results to come back from the laboratory. I nodded slowly, locking the medical file securely back inside the manila folder. Because once we know the true identity of the real biological father, I added, we will not just be exposing a lie. We will be burning their entire reality to the ground. We will invite them all to a glorious celebration of their supposed victory, and we will execute them in front of an audience. The midnight storm continued to rage outside our windows, but inside that kitchen, the atmosphere had completely shifted. We were no longer grieving victims hiding in the dark. We were the architects of their absolute ruin. The next morning arrived with a glaring sunlight that perfectly matched my state of mind. I drove to the corporate office of Aura Staging LLC with my spine perfectly straight and my emotions completely locked away. DeAndre was hidden in my guest house, working on his legal maneuvers, while I had a multi-million-dollar business to run. I walked past the remaining protesters outside my building without even blinking at their handmade cardboard signs. They were just noisy background extras in a movie they did not realize was already over. I took the private elevator up to my floor and settled into my leather chair, ready to finalize the interior design contracts for a massive new high-rise development downtown. I was sipping my black coffee and reviewing a digital rendering when the heavy glass doors of my corporate suite suddenly and violently swung open. My receptionist let out a startled gasp as two very familiar figures completely bypassed her security desk, ignoring her protests, and stormed directly into my private office. It was my father, Harrison, and my mother, Brenda. They looked furious. They had clearly spent the entire morning fuming over my refusal to immediately surrender to their aggressive legal tactics and the frozen bank accounts. Harrison did not even bother to say hello. He marched straight up to my workspace and slammed his hands down hard on the pristine surface of my mahogany desk, scattering my neatly organized architectural blueprints onto the hardwood floor. Brenda stood right behind him, clutching her expensive designer handbag and glaring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are making a massive mistake, Audra," my father growled, his face turning an ugly shade of red. "We gave you 24 hours to review the paperwork and sign the deed over to Sierra. I just got off the phone with our lawyers, and they told me you have not even contacted them to arrange a settlement. You are deliberately stalling and playing games with your sister's livelihood." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply took another slow sip of my coffee and looked at them as if they were two unruly toddlers throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "I am not playing games, Dad," I replied, my voice as smooth and cold as a sheet of ice. I am simply refusing to hand over an $8 million asset to a woman who has spent her entire life stealing from me while you both cheered her on. My mother let out a dramatic gasp, pressing a hand to her chest, as if she had just been physically struck. How dare you speak about your sister that way? Brenda shrieked, taking a step forward. Sierra is a grieving mother, trying to protect Nathaniel's innocent child from your vicious greed. She has never stolen a single thing from you in her entire life. You have always been insanely jealous of her, and now you are projecting your own bitter flaws onto her. I set my coffee mug down on the desk. The sheer delusional audacity of her statement was almost impressive. They had rewritten our entire family history to paint Sierra as a flawless angel, and me as the cold, wealthy villain. But I was done playing along with their twisted narrative. I decided it was time to rip the bandages off some very old and deeply infected wounds. Never stolen a single thing from me, I repeated slowly, leaning back in my leather chair and resting my hands in my lap. Let us take a quick trip down memory lane, Mother. Do you remember when Sierra was 24 years old and facing complete financial ruin because she maxed out 5 different credit cards on luxury vacations and designer clothes? Do you remember how she came crying to you and Dad because her creditors were threatening to sue her and garnish her wages? My parents completely froze. They had not expected me to bring up the past. They always demanded that we sweep Sierra failures under the rug and never speak of them again. You both cornered me in this exact office, I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You told me that because my staging business was finally becoming profitable, it was my family duty to protect my younger sister. You literally forced me to hand over $30,000 of my own hard-earned savings to pay off her massive debt. You promised me she would pay me back every single month. It has been 6 years, and I have not seen a single dime. But I did not say a word, because I was the good, responsible daughter. I absorbed the massive financial hit so she could keep living her fantasy life. Harrison stood up slightly straighter, trying to regain control of the room. That was different, he snapped, waving his hand dismissively. That was a family loan to help her get back on her feet. You had plenty of money to spare, Audra. You are bringing up ancient history just to deflect from the fact that you are currently trying to make her and her baby homeless. I smiled, a completely dead expression that did not reach my eyes. It is not ancient history, Dad, I replied smoothly. It is a very well-documented pattern of theft. Because 3 years after I paid off her debt, she decided she suddenly wanted to be a high-end interior designer, just like me. Do you remember how she magically landed that prestigious downtown firm job with zero training? She got that job because she sneaked into my apartment and stole my entire college design portfolio. She literally presented my original grueling hard work as her own. When I confronted you both, you told me to let her have the victory. Brenda slammed her hand down. You are selfish for hoarding wealth, Audra. Surrender the house immediately. I remained stone cold. I looked at her hand resting on my desk, her perfectly manicured nails tapping frantically against the polished wood. You are fundamentally misunderstanding the reality of this situation, Mother, I said, leaning forward slightly, so my voice would carry the exact weight of my authority. I am not hoarding wealth. I am protecting my legally acquired assets from a family of highly predictable parasites. Brenda's mouth fell open in sheer outrage, but before she could formulate another hysterical scream, my father completely lost what little restraint he had left. Harrison had never been a man who could handle being told no by a woman, especially not by the daughter he had spent his entire life trying to control. He took a massive step forward, completely invading my personal space. He leaned his heavy frame directly over my mahogany desk, planting both of his hands firmly on top of my architectural blueprints. His face was dangerously close to mine, and I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, masking a desperate panic. You listen to me very carefully, Audra, he growled, his voice dropping into a vicious, threatening register that I had not heard since I was a terrified teenager living under his roof. We are completely done playing this little corporate boss game with you. You think you are completely untouchable because you sit in this fancy corner office and wear expensive tailored suits. But you forget who raised you. You forget that I know exactly how this luxury real estate industry works. It is entirely built on reputation and public image. I maintained absolute eye contact with him. I did not shrink back into my leather chair. I did not blink. I just let him keep talking, knowing perfectly well that angry, arrogant men always talk far too much when they think they have the upper hand. I have spent the entire morning doing some very interesting research, Harrison continued, a sickeningly triumphant smirk spreading across his reddening face. I know exactly who your biggest corporate clients are right now. I know you are finalizing a massive interior design contract with the Vanguard Development Group for those new downtown penthouses. I know you are staging 3 different properties for Elite Horizon Reality. Those contracts are worth millions of dollars in continuous revenue for your little company. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the heavy air of the office. He thought he had just played a brilliant winning card. And what exactly does my corporate client list have to do with Sierra's fraudulent claim to my house, I asked, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and dangerously calm. It has everything to do with it, Brenda snapped from behind him, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Your father is trying to explain to you that your entire business is hanging by a single thread, and we are holding the scissors. Harrison nodded aggressively, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. If you do not contact our lawyers and sign the deed to that $8 million house over to Sierra by 5 o'clock this evening, I am going to make some phone calls. I am going to personally contact the CEO of Vanguard Development and the board members of Elite Horizon. I am going to tell them that the woman they are doing business with is a morally bankrupt monster who is intentionally throwing her dead husband's infant son out onto the streets. He leaned in even closer, his voice dripping with pure malice. I will send them the link to Sierra GoFundMe page. I will show them the videos of the angry protesters swarming the pavement right outside this very building. I will make absolutely sure they know that associating with Aura Staging LLC is a massive public relations disaster. We will drag your name through the mud so thoroughly that you will never stage a single closet in this city ever again. We will bankrupt you, Audra. We will completely destroy your entire life. I let his threat echo in the silent office. I needed to be absolutely certain the parameters of his threat were crystal clear for the permanent record. Let me make sure I am understanding your terms correctly, Dad, I said, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. You are explicitly stating that unless I surrender an $8 million piece of real estate to you and Sierra, you are going to intentionally sabotage my corporate contracts to cause me massive financial ruin. You are threatening to destroy my business unless I give you my property. Yes, Harrison barked, slamming his fist down on the desk. That is exactly what I am saying. You sign the house over to your sister today, or you lose your company tomorrow. You have absolutely no other choice. We are not leaving this office until you pick up that phone and call the lawyers to finalize the transfer. Brenda nodded in furious agreement. We are doing this for your own good, Audra. You forced our hand. This is the only way to save the family and get Lucas the inheritance he deserves. I looked at my parents. They looked so incredibly proud of themselves. They truly believed they had just executed a flawless checkmate. They thought they had cornered the helpless widow. But they had completely forgotten that I had spent the last decade navigating the vicious cutthroat world of luxury corporate real estate. I did not survive in this industry by being easily intimidated. I slowly uncrossed my legs and reached my right hand underneath the thick wooden lip of my desk. My fingers found the small, concealed plastic button installed directly beneath my keyboard tray. It was a silent panic alarm connected directly to the building armed security team in the main lobby. I pressed it firmly twice, holding it down on the second press to signal a hostile physical threat in the executive suite. Then I casually brought my hand back up to the surface of my desk. I reached over toward a stack of architectural blueprints and moved the top paper aside. Hidden perfectly underneath the blueprint was my secondary corporate smartphone. The screen was dark, but the microphone was fully active. I tapped the screen once to wake it up and deliberately pressed the large red square on the voice memo application. The digital counter stopped at exactly 14 minutes and 32 seconds. What are you doing? Harrison demanded, his triumphant smirk faltering slightly as he watched my completely unbothered movements. Who are you calling? I told you to call the lawyers, not play on your phone. I am not calling anyone, Dad, I replied, picking up the device and holding it up so the bright screen was clearly visible to both of them. I just wanted to make sure I safely stopped the audio recording before the file got too large to easily email. I have been recording this entire interaction since the moment you bypassed my receptionist and forced your way into my private office. The color instantly drained from Harrison's face. Brenda let out a strangled gasp, taking a rapid step backward, as if the small rectangular device in my hand was a live grenade. I smiled a genuine chilling smile that finally reached my eyes. I looked directly at my father, who was suddenly frozen in complete terror. You see, Dad, what you just did is not a clever family negotiation, I explained, my voice echoing with absolute authority in the quiet room. Threatening to intentionally destroy someone's business and ruin their financial livelihood unless they surrender a highly valuable financial asset is not a legal strategy. It is the textbook definition of felony extortion. It is a severe criminal offense punishable by several years in a state penitentiary. You are bluffing. Harrison stammered, his loud, aggressive voice suddenly shrinking into a pathetic, breathless whisper. You would never send your own parents to jail. You would not dare do that to us. I tapped the screen, hitting the save icon, and instantly backing the audio file up to my secure cloud server. Try me, I whispered, leaning forward. You came into my territory. You threatened my livelihood. You tried to use my dead husband's memory as a weapon to steal from me. I will not hesitate to hand this recording directly to the district attorney if you ever threaten me again. The heavy glass doors of my office suddenly swung open again. 3 large, heavily armed security guards from the building lobby stepped into the room. They completely surrounded my parents, their hands resting casually near their utility belts. Is there a problem here, Ms. Audra? The lead security officer asked, his eyes locked entirely on Harrison. Yes, I replied smoothly, picking up my coffee mug and taking a long, relaxed sip. These 2 individuals were just leaving. They are permanently banned from the premises. If they ever step foot in this building or on the plaza outside again, I want them immediately arrested for criminal trespassing. Harrison opened his mouth to argue, but the lead guard stepped firmly into his path, leaving him absolutely no room to move except toward the door. Brenda was already practically running out of the office, covering her face with her designer handbag in total humiliation. My father looked back at me one last time, his eyes wide with a brand new, terrifying realization. He finally understood that I was not the victim in this story anymore. I was the predator, and I was just getting started. I watched through the glass walls of my office as the security team escorted my utterly defeated parents toward the elevator bank. My father did not look back. My mother was practically hyperventilating into her designer handbag. Once the elevator doors slid shut, I walked back to my desk and picked up the thick manila envelope containing the injunction and the supposed will Sierra had filed with the probate court. I slid the documents into my leather briefcase. I had successfully neutralized my parents and secured undeniable proof of their extortion, but they were only the desperate accomplices. The real architect of this massive financial fraud was my sister, and it was time to tear her primary weapon completely apart. I left the building through the private executive garage and drove straight to the downtown high-rise that housed my corporate legal team. I did not use a standard family lawyer for my business. I retained a high-powered corporate litigation firm that specialized in hostile takeovers and contract law. The senior partner, Marcus, was a brilliant, ruthless attorney who had helped me navigate the vicious luxury real estate market for the past 7 years. He did not deal in emotions or family drama. He dealt exclusively in cold, hard, verifiable facts. I bypassed the reception desk and walked directly into his spacious corner office, dropping the manila envelope onto his pristine glass conference table. Marcus looked up from his laptop, adjusting his silver-framed glasses. He took one look at my face and immediately closed his computer, knowing this was not a routine contract review. I need you to completely dismantle a legal document, I said, pulling the copy of the filed will from the envelope and sliding it across the glass. My sister filed this with the probate court yesterday. She is claiming Nathaniel left her half of my estate to support a child she claims is his. Marcus picked up the document. He did not ask how I was feeling or offer meaningless condolences. He immediately shifted into analytical mode. He scanned the first page, his eyes darting quickly across the text. Within 30 seconds, he let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. Audra, this document is an absolute joke, Marcus stated, flattening the paper on the table. The formatting is completely inconsistent. The margins shift drastically between page 1 and page 2. The legal terminology used in the 3rd paragraph contradicts the jurisdiction clause in the 5th paragraph. Whoever drafted this did not go to law school. They downloaded a cheap generic legal template from the internet and hastily filled in the blanks. I know, I replied, taking a seat across from him. Nathaniel was a meticulous history teacher who obsessed over proper grammar and structure. He would have never signed something this sloppy, but the probate judge granted a temporary injunction based on this filing. Sierra managed to freeze my personal accounts and put a lien on the house. I need concrete, undeniable proof that this document is a complete fabrication before the probate hearing. Marcus nodded slowly. He picked up his desk phone and pressed a single button. Within 2 minutes, a younger man wearing a dark suit walked into the office. This was David, the firm digital forensics specialist. David spent his days analyzing forged corporate contracts and fraudulent digital signatures for multi-million-dollar lawsuits. David, Marcus commanded, handing the document to him. I need a full forensic analysis on this signature and the document metadata. It was filed electronically with the probate court yesterday afternoon. Pull the original digital submission from the county database and tell me exactly how it was constructed. David took the document and left the room without a word. For the next hour, Marcus and I reviewed my corporate accounts, ensuring that Aura Staging LLC was completely insulated from the personal freeze. Sierra thought she had cut off my money, but she had only frozen my personal checking account. My corporate wealth remained entirely untouched and fully accessible. An hour later, David returned to the office carrying a sleek silver tablet. He placed it on the glass table between Marcus and me. He had pulled the original PDF file Sierra submitted to the court system and completely deconstructed the digital layers of the document. You were absolutely right to be suspicious. David began swiping the screen to enlarge a high-resolution image of the last page. The text itself was stitched together using a free open-source word processor. We can see the digital footprint of the software in the file metadata. But the real smoking gun is the signature itself. He tapped the screen, highlighting the bold ink signature that spelled out Nathaniel James. It looked identical to my late husband's handwriting. At first glance, it was a perfect match. But David zoomed in closer and closer until the black ink began to blur into tiny, jagged squares on the screen. This signature was not signed on this piece of paper, David explained, pointing to the edges of the ink. It was digitally cropped from another source and photoshopped directly onto the document. The digital compression of the image file gives it away entirely. When you enlarge a naturally scanned piece of paper, the grain of the physical paper should be visible everywhere. But here, the background immediately surrounding the signature is completely transparent, indicating it was digitally cut out using a lasso tool in a basic editing program. You can see the severe pixelation artifacts around the loops of the letters. I stared at the enlarged signature on the screen. There was a very specific flaw in the way the ink faded at the end of the letter S. It was not a natural fading of a pen stroke. It looked like the pen had momentarily dragged across a slight bump in the paper, causing the ink to skip, leaving a tiny hollow white space inside the black line. I had seen that exact tiny flaw before. My mind raced backward through years of paperwork and holiday mailings until it finally clicked. I pulled my smartphone out of my purse and quickly opened my digital photo backup. I searched for the folder labeled Christmas 4 years ago. We had sent out custom-printed holiday cards to our entire family that year. Nathaniel had personally signed every single card with a heavy black fountain pen. I found the high-resolution scan of the card we had mailed to my parents and zoomed in on his signature. I placed my phone directly next to the tablet on the glass table, the heavy black ink, the exact same loops, and most importantly, the identical skipped ink flaw at the very end of the letter S. It was a perfect one-to-one match. She stole his signature from a 4-year-old Christmas card, I whispered, staring at the two screens. My parents had kept that exact card displayed on their mantle for an entire month. Sierra must have dug it out of my mother-obsessive keepsake boxes, specifically to harvest Nathaniel handwriting. The sheer premeditation required to dig through years of old holiday greetings just to find a clean signature to steal was absolutely disgusting. She scanned the holiday card we sent to them, cropped his name out, and pasted it onto a fake will. Marcus leaned forward, staring at the matching signatures. His eyes were cold and calculating. He slowly pushed his silver glasses up the bridge of his nose. Audra, this completely changes the landscape of this entire situation, Marcus said, his voice deadly serious. Your sister did not just lie to your family. She did not just start a vicious rumor on the internet to embarrass you. By intentionally fabricating this document and officially submitting it to a judge to secure a financial injunction, she has crossed a massive legal line. He tapped the tablet screen with a heavy finger. This is felony forgery. By swearing under oath that this document was genuine when she filed it, she committed felony perjury. And because she is using it to attempt to extort an $8 million asset, she is looking at severe criminal fraud charges. If we take this forensic evidence to the district attorney today, Sierra is going to a state penitentiary for a very long time. I sat back in my chair, feeling the cold leather against my spine. Sierra had built her entire hostile takeover on a fragile house of cards, and I had just found the heavy gust of wind needed to blow it all down. She had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her freedom entirely. Do we take it to the district attorney right now? Marcus asked, ready to unleash his legal team. No, I replied immediately, shaking my head. Not yet. I want them to feel like they are winning. I want my parents to invite their wealthy friends to celebrate their glorious victory. We are going to let them walk right into a trap they can never escape. Keep this forensic report ready, Marcus. We are going to drop this bomb in front of a live audience. Marcus nodded slowly, sliding the tablet with the digital forensic report into a secure drawer of his desk to keep the evidence perfectly safe. He then reached back across the sleek glass table and picked up the thick manila envelope containing the emergency injunction that had frozen my personal checking accounts. He pulled out the specific court order that placed a temporary legal lien on my $8 million estate. He began to carefully read through the specific property claims my sister had officially filed with the probate judge. The room was completely silent for a few moments, except for the faint hum of the city traffic far below. Then a very strange thing happened. Marcus began to laugh. It was not a polite professional chuckle. It was a deep, genuine laugh that echoed off the glass walls of his massive corner office. I had worked closely with him for 7 years navigating complex corporate real estate deals, and I had never seen him break his stone-cold professional demeanor like this before. "What is so funny?" I asked, leaning forward in my leather chair, feeling a sudden spark of curiosity. He shook his head, tapping his expensive silver pen against the legal document. "Your sister and your parents hired an incredibly aggressive probate litigation firm." He explained, his amusement still clearly visible on his face. "But in their frantic rush to secure a freeze on your assets before you could effectively fight back, they completely skipped doing a basic county property records check. They filed a hostile claim against an $8 million asset, assuming it was standard marital property." Marcus leaned entirely across the glass table. "Audra, they placed a legal lien on a house that you do not even personally own." I smiled, feeling a profound sense of absolute satisfaction wash over me. The irony of the situation was absolutely delicious. Sierra had gone to the extreme lengths of committing multiple felonies to steal half of a house that Nathaniel had never legally possessed. When my staging business started generating massive revenue 5 years ago, I made a highly strategic financial decision, I explained to Marcus. I purchased that sprawling mansion entirely under the corporate umbrella of Aura Staging LLC. It was a dual-purpose investment to host high-end real estate clients and physically showcase our luxury design capabilities. Nathaniel fully supported the strategic decision. His name was never on the deed, and my personal name is not on the deed either. It is a 100% corporate-owned asset. Marcus tossed the injunction back onto the table with a look of pure legal triumph. "This entire legal freeze is fundamentally useless," he stated confidently. "A probate judge has absolutely no jurisdiction to place a lien on a corporate asset for a personal inheritance dispute. I can draft a dismissal motion right now. We can walk down to the courthouse and have this injunction immediately thrown out by noon. Your personal accounts will be completely unfrozen and the property lien will be erased entirely." I looked down at the useless piece of paper resting on the glass table. The overwhelming temptation to instantly crush their legal chokehold was incredibly strong. But I vividly remembered the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of my parents, standing in my office aggressively threatening my entire livelihood. "No," I said, my voice turning ice-cold and perfectly precise. "Do not file the dismissal yet, Marcus." He raised an eyebrow, looking completely surprised by my sudden command to hold off. "If we destroy their legal leverage today, they will immediately know we are onto their scheme," I explained slowly. "I want them to firmly believe they are winning this war. I want them to feel so secure and so untouchable in their fake victory that they invite their most elite friends to celebrate. Let my personal account stay temporarily frozen. Let the house stay under the completely useless lien. We are not just going to win a simple court case, Marcus. We are going to publicly execute their entire social standing." I left the corporate law firm feeling an intense, dangerous calm settling over my entire body. I drove back to my sprawling estate, navigating the winding roads with a crystal-clear vision of the absolute carnage I was about to unleash on my family. When I walked through the heavy front doors of the mansion, the house was completely silent. I found DeAndre sitting at the massive quartz kitchen island, exactly where I had left him hours ago. But the atmosphere around him had drastically changed. The shattered, exhausted man who had arrived on my doorstep in the pouring rain was entirely gone. In his place sat a man radiating a cold, focused energy. A sleek silver laptop was open in front of him, its screen glowing brightly in the dim light of the kitchen. He looked up as I dropped my keys onto the counter. The expedited laboratory results came back, DeAndre announced, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. I walked around the island and stood behind him, looking down at the glowing screen. The official genetics report was fully displayed in a secured PDF viewer. The heavy black text at the bottom of the page confirmed what we both already knew in our hearts. The probability of paternity was exactly 0%. DeAndre had no biological connection to the little boy he had raised and loved for an entire year. I placed a hand on his shoulder, expecting him to finally break down under the crushing weight of the absolute truth. But DeAndre simply closed the PDF file and immediately opened a new browser tab. I did not just order a standard paternity test, he explained, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. When I shipped the DNA sample to the laboratory, I paid an extra fee to have the raw genetic data cross-referenced against their massive global ancestry database. I knew Sierra was lying about Nathaniel being the father. I needed to know exactly whose child she was actually hiding. He hit the enter key, and a highly detailed genetic family tree populated the screen. The database had found an immediate familial match. It was not a distant cousin or a vague geographical link. It was a primary first-degree relative match. Look at the name attached to the highest genetic probability, DeAndre said, pointing a steady finger at the screen. I leaned in closer, my eyes scanning the digital family tree, until they locked onto the name highlighted in bright blue text. My breath hitched in my throat, and the cold, hard reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. The DNA pointed directly to a first-degree relative of Bradley. Bradley was not just a random stranger. He was an incredibly wealthy, married real estate developer. More importantly, he was my father Harrison's absolute best friend and his longtime Sunday golf partner. I stared at the name on the screen, my mind racing as the puzzle pieces finally violently snapped together. My sister had not just cheated on her husband. She had actively engaged in a reckless affair with our father's wealthy married best friend. When Bradley refused to leave his wife and cut off her funding, Sierra panicked. She passed the child off as DeAndre's son to secure a stable life. But the moment my wealthy husband died, she saw a massive golden opportunity. She weaponized a dead man to extort millions of dollars to cover up her dark tracks. She was a monster, and we finally had the exact weapon required to destroy her. I stepped back from the kitchen island, pulling a heavy breath into my lungs. Bradley, I whispered, saying the name out loud, to make the horrifying reality set in. My father plays golf with him every single Sunday at the exclusive country club. He is a multi-millionaire commercial developer who practically owns half of the downtown skyline, and he has been married to his high school sweetheart for 30 years. He has a pristine public image to protect. DeAndre nodded, his jaw clenching tight. It makes perfect sense, Audra. Think about Sierra and her constant sickening obsession with status and wealth. She was never genuinely satisfied with my income. She always wanted the extravagant luxury lifestyle that you and Nathaniel had successfully built, but she absolutely refused to actually work for it. We stood together in the dim kitchen and began to verbally piece the entire dark timeline together. Sierra had clearly targeted Bradley, hoping to secure a massive financial payout from a very wealthy older man. She probably thought she could easily manipulate him into leaving his loyal wife and handing over half of his commercial real estate fortune. But Bradley was a ruthless, calculating businessman who did not tolerate liabilities. When Sierra got pregnant and demanded a lavish lifestyle, he must have instantly cut her off entirely, refusing to blow up his marriage and risk his massive empire for a secret affair. And that is exactly when she completely panicked, I said, pacing rapidly across the polished hardwood floor. She needed a stable, believable cover story and a reliable source of income immediately. So she ran straight back to you, DeAndre. She manipulated you into believing the child was yours, trapping you in a web of emotional abuse and financial dependency. DeAndre looked down at his large hands, his voice dropping to a harsh, bitter whisper. I gave her absolutely everything I had. I worked 80-hour weeks to provide a perfect home for that little boy. And she just sat there happily spending my hard-earned paychecks, knowing I was completely oblivious to her betrayal. But your honest income was never going to be enough to permanently satisfy her endless greed. I continued, stopping my pacing and looking directly at him. Then my husband suddenly died. Sierra looked at Nathaniel and saw a tragic golden opportunity. She saw a dead, defenseless man who could not demand a paternity test to defend his own honor. She looked at my $8 million estate and saw the ultimate payday she had originally wanted to extract from Bradley. She decided to drastically upgrade her victim. DeAndre stated firmly, slamming his silver laptop shut. She swapped a living target who aggressively rejected her for a dead one who could not physically fight back. She turned your massive tragedy into her personal lottery ticket. I walked back over to the large quartz island and stood firmly beside him. The complete picture was finally clear. We now held every single piece of the puzzle. We possessed the digital forensic report proving she fabricated her legal documents. We had the secret audio recording of my parents committing felony extortion in my corporate office. and we held the undeniable genetic evidence proving Bradley was the true father, completely exonerating Nathaniel forever. "Are you ready to finish this?" I asked DeAndre, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of mercy. He looked up at me, his dark eyes burning with a cold, focused rage. "I have never been more ready in my entire life, Audra. It is time to execute the final blow," I said, turning toward the door. "Let us go completely destroy her." I walked away from the kitchen island and pulled my phone from my pocket. If we were going to completely destroy Sierra, we needed the perfect stage and a captive audience. I opened the messaging application and navigated to the toxic family group chat that I had kept perfectly muted for the last 5 days. I took a deep breath, deliberately shifting my entire mental state into the role of a shattered, defeated widow. I needed my text message to radiate absolute despair. I typed slowly, meticulously, crafting every single word to feed their endless, insatiable egos. I told them that the relentless stress of the legal injunction and the terrible public protests had finally broken me. I wrote that my corporate business was actively crumbling under the massive pressure, just as Harrison had threatened, and I simply did not have the emotional strength to fight my own flesh and blood anymore. "I am just so incredibly exhausted," I typed, my thumbs flying across the digital keyboard. "I cannot keep fighting you. You win. I am completely ready to surrender the house and sign the legal settlement papers immediately." I showed the draft message to DeAndre. He read it over my shoulder and let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "They are going to absolutely devour that," he stated, crossing his arms. "It is exactly what they have been desperately waiting to hear from you." I pressed send and watched the small green text bubble appear on the screen. Then I immediately followed it up with the final piece of the trap. I invited Harrison, Brenda, and Sierra to my home that evening. I proposed a formal will reading and a catered mediation dinner in my main dining room. I told them to bring the final transfer deeds and assured them that I would have my notary public present to officially sign the $8 million estate completely over to Sierra. The digital response was almost instantaneous. Within 45 seconds, 3 separate red receipts appeared at the bottom of the screen. They had all dropped whatever they were doing to eagerly consume my absolute surrender. Less than a minute later, my mother replied with a sickeningly sweet message about how glad she was that I had finally come to my senses and chosen family over selfish greed. Harrison sent a brief, arrogant confirmation that they would arrive precisely at 7:00 sharp with all the necessary legal documents. "They took the bait without a single moment of hesitation," I said, locking my phone screen and tossing it onto the court's counter. "They are so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they cannot even see the massive steel trap closing directly over their heads." I turned to DeAndre, who was already closing his laptop and gathering his heavy coat. "Go home and change into your best formal suit," I instructed him. "Tonight we are hosting a private dinner party and we are going to serve them absolute ruin on a silver platter." After DeAndre left, I spent the next hour transforming the massive formal dining room into the ultimate execution chamber. I arranged the long mahogany table with my most expensive crystal and heavy silver cutlery, ensuring every single detail was flawlessly intimidating. As I polished a wine glass, my phone buzzed sharply on the kitchen counter. It was a push notification from the anonymous social media account I utilized to secretly monitor my sister's online activity. I tapped the glowing screen and found exactly what I anticipated. Sierra had just posted a brand new, highly produced video update for her loyal army of internet supporters. She was sitting on the expensive white leather sofa in my parents' lavish living room, holding a tall glass of sparkling champagne. She wore a smug, deeply victorious smile that made my blood run absolutely cold. The bold text caption across the screen read, "Justice finally served." In the video, she practically giggled as she proudly announced to her thousands of followers that her wicked, greedy sister had finally completely cracked under the intense public pressure. She claimed that family love had conquered corporate greed, and she would be officially moving into her rightful $8 million mansion by the end of the week. She dramatically thanked everyone for their generous financial donations and promised a massive luxury house tour very soon. I watched the sickening video twice, feeling nothing but cold, calculated anticipation. She was entirely drunk on a legal victory that did not actually exist. But my sister's reckless online arrogance was absolutely nothing compared to the towering, bloated ego of my parents. Less than an hour later, my mother sent another long text message to our muted group chat. It was technically framed as a polite notification, but it was dripping with pure, undeniable condescension. She casually informed me that they were bringing a few very special guests to the private mediation dinner. She claimed they needed respectable neutral third-party witnesses to ensure I did not attempt any last-minute corporate tricks during the final contract signing. I opened the detailed message and slowly read the names of the invited guests. My heart gave a heavy, vicious thud against my ribs as a dark smile spread across my face. They had not just invited random neighborhood friends. Harrison and Brenda had specifically invited 3 of their wealthiest high society connections from the exclusive country club to watch them force their difficult, rebellious daughter into total submission. And right at the very top of that guest list was my father, longtime best friend Bradley, and his elegant, devoted wife of 30 years, Eleanor. My parents were so incredibly blinded by their own desperate greed and their pathetic need to publicly display their absolute dominance that they were intentionally bringing my ultimate weapon directly into my home. They wanted a captive, wealthy audience to applaud their fake benevolence and witness my total humiliating defeat. They had absolutely no idea they were unwittingly assembling the exact audience required for their own spectacular social execution. I typed a quick, polite reply telling my mother that extra guests were perfectly fine and I would simply set a few more plates at the table. Then I walked over to the dining room and carefully arranged a specific seat of honor right at the center of the table directly across from where Sierra would sit. It was a seat reserved entirely for Bradley. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy brass doorbell echoed through the silent expanse of the mansion. I stood perfectly still in the grand foyer, taking one final steadying breath before reaching out and pulling the massive oak doors open. The cold evening air swept inside, carrying with it a suffocating wave of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Harrison and Brenda stood at the absolute front of the group, practically vibrating with a sickening sense of ultimate victory. Sierra flanked them wearing a highly inappropriate designer cocktail dress she had clearly purchased with her internet scam money. Behind my toxic family stood Bradley, looking surprisingly stiff and remarkably uncomfortable in his tailored charcoal suit, alongside his elegant wife Eleanor, who simply offered me a polite, confused smile. I did not offer them warm greetings or take their expensive coats. I simply stepped aside and allowed the entire group to flow into my massive modern living room. The space was designed to intimidate, featuring soaring 20-foot ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark city skyline, and a massive 80-inch smart television mounted seamlessly into the black marble fireplace. DeAndre was already standing silently in the far corner of the room, wearing a sharp black suit, perfectly playing the role of a neutral observer. My parents immediately fanned out across the room, acting as if they already owned every single piece of luxury furniture. Harrison confidently gestured for Bradley and Eleanor to take the best seats on the plush velvet sectional. Sierra did not even bother to sit down. She marched straight toward the center of the room and aggressively slapped a thick manila folder directly onto the center of my flawless glass coffee table. "Here are the final settlement papers, Audra!" She announced, her voice shrill and echoing loudly in the cavernous space. "It is the exact same copy of the will the probate judge already approved. Let us stop wasting time. Hand me a pen so you can sign the deed transfer, and we can finally pop the expensive champagne I know you keep in that massive cellar." Harrison stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Sierra's shoulder. He turned to face Bradley and Eleanor, puffing his chest out to deliver a meticulously rehearsed performance for his wealthy friends. "We know this has been a remarkably difficult week for our family." Harrison began, his voice dripping with a fake, sickeningly sweet benevolence. "But tonight is truly about forgiveness. It is about remembering that family blood is absolutely thicker than any temporary corporate misunderstanding. Audra has finally seen the light and realized that doing the morally right thing for her sister and her poor fatherless nephew is far more important than hoarding empty wealth. We are just so incredibly proud to guide her back to the moral path." Eleanor nodded politely, but Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting nervously around the imposing room as if his sharp business instincts were sensing a hidden trap. He glanced at DeAndre and then back at me, his posture rigid. Sierra impatiently tapped her manicured nails against the glass table, breaking the brief silence. "The pen, Audra," she demanded, extending her empty hand toward me. I did not look at the fraudulent legal document resting on the glass. I did not look at her outstretched hand. I did not shed a single tear of defeat. Instead, I calmly walked over to the sleek media console and picked up a small black remote control. I turned my back to my utterly confused family and pressed a single silver button. The massive smart television mounted on the black marble wall instantly flared to life, bathing the entire living room in a harsh, bright glow that completely shattered their comfortable illusion. The high-definition screen did not display a family photo or a financial chart. It displayed a stark black and white digital scan of an official medical document. The heavy bold letterhead at the top of the page clearly belonged to the primary oncology department of the State University Hospital. I tapped a button on the remote, and the screen zoomed in directly on the center of the page, highlighting a specific diagnostic paragraph in bright yellow. The entire living room fell completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic drifting through the massive glass windows. Harrison and Brenda squinted at the bright screen, trying to make sense of the complex medical terminology. But Sierra did not need to squint. She stared at the massive television, and the smug, triumphant smirk instantly vanished from her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. "That is a certified copy of my late husband's complete medical history," I announced, my voice echoing coldly through the cavernous room. I did not raise my tone. I did not yell. I simply let the undeniable facts speak entirely for themselves. As you can all clearly see, Nathaniel was diagnosed with a severe aggressive form of leukemia when he was exactly 18 years old. He survived, but the heavy continuous rounds of aggressive radiation and chemotherapy completely destroyed his reproductive system. I tapped the remote again, and the screen zoomed in even closer on the final diagnostic conclusion signed by the chief oncologist. The bold black text filled the entire 80-inch screen. The words were impossible to misunderstand. Total azoospermia. 100% irreversible sterility. 0 viable sperm count. My mother let out a tiny confused gasp. Harrison froze, his hand still resting awkwardly on the glass coffee table next to the forged will. On the velvet sectional, Bradley sat perfectly rigid, his eyes darting from the screen to Sierra, and then back to the screen again. He was a smart man, and he was rapidly beginning to understand that he had walked directly into a massive explosive trap. I slowly lowered the remote control and turned my full attention to my sister. She was standing frozen in the center of the room. All the color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her hands were shaking so violently that her expensive designer rings clinked softly together. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, closing the physical distance between us. The heavy silence in the room was absolutely suffocating. I looked directly into her wide, panicked eyes, completely stripping away the helpless widow persona I had worn for the group chat. "So tell me, Sierra," I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly whisper that carried to every single corner of the quiet room. "How exactly did you get pregnant by a man who could not produce children?" She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. She looked frantically at our parents and then desperately at Bradley, but nobody offered her a single shred of protection. The flawless, untouchable narrative she had meticulously built over the past week was instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the very elite social audience she had intended to impress. She was entirely exposed as a vicious, lying fraud, and we had not even reached the most devastating part of the evening. The deafening silence in the living room was suddenly broken by the heavy metallic click of the main entrance echoing from the grand foyer. I had intentionally left the front doors unlocked for this exact moment. While my parents and their wealthy friends were entirely paralyzed by the glowing medical records on the massive television screen, DeAndre had silently stepped outside to his vehicle to retrieve his own highly classified legal ammunition. He strode purposefully back into the grand foyer and straight into the living room, his heavy footsteps echoing against the polished hardwood floors with the rhythmic precision of a ticking bomb. He was no longer the quiet, neutral observer standing passively in the shadows. He was a man completely unburdened and entirely ready to go to absolute war. Brenda let out a sharp, offended gasp as she finally registered his dramatic entrance. Harrison immediately puffed out his chest, his face flushing with a sudden aggressive anger masking his growing panic. "What in the world is he doing here?" Harrison demanded, pointing a shaking finger directly at DeAndre. "This is a private family mediation. He has absolutely no legal right to be in this house." DeAndre did not even blink. He completely ignored my father's loud, arrogant demands, acting as if Harrison was entirely invisible. He kept his dark, furious eyes locked exclusively on his wife. Sierra instinctively took a small, terrified step backward, her spine pressing hard against the edge of the velvet sectional. The sheer physical presence of her husband radiating pure, unapologetic fury was clearly something she had never experienced before. For an entire year, she had treated him like a foolish, disposable asset. Tonight, she was finally facing the devastating, unavoidable consequences of her cruelty. DeAndre walked straight up to the glass coffee table. He raised his right hand and violently slammed a thick, heavy legal binder directly on top of the flimsy manila folder Sierra had placed there earlier. The loud crack of the binder hitting the glass echoed sharply through the room, causing Eleanor to physically flinch in her seat. Divorce papers. DeAndre announced, his voice remarkably steady and echoing with absolute finality. And a comprehensive civil lawsuit for massive financial fraud, emotional abuse, and intentional deceit. Sierra stared down at the heavy legal binder as if it were a highly venomous snake. Her mouth opened and closed, but she was entirely incapable of forming a single coherent word. Her flawless, impenetrable victim routine was actively disintegrating in real time. You honestly thought you had executed the perfect crime? DeAndre continued, leaning slightly forward over the glass table, his voice dripping with pure disgust. You thought you could permanently trap me in a fabricated life and bleed my bank accounts dry to fund your endless luxury shopping habits. You watched me work brutal 80-hour weeks at the firm. You watched me sacrifice my entire social life and empty my personal savings to provide a perfect, comfortable home for a child you swore was mine. You sat across from me at the dinner table every single night and lied directly to my face without a single ounce of hesitation. He turned away from her and looked directly at the captive audience sitting on the velvet sectional. He locked eyes with Bradley, whose face had turned an alarming shade of gray. I am entirely, completely sterile to her endless, pathetic lies, DeAndre stated, addressing the entire room. She spent the last week desperately trying to convince everyone that her child belonged to a dead man. She tried to convince me that I was a terrible, inadequate husband for questioning her timeline. But numbers do not lie, and science does not care about her manufactured internet tears. DeAndre reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He snapped it open with a sharp, aggressive flick of his wrist. This is a fully certified, expedited DNA report from a highly accredited national laboratory, he declared, holding the paper up for everyone to clearly see. I had an official swab collected from the child and tested against my own genetics. The results are completely undeniable and legally binding in any family court in this state. I have absolutely zero biological connection to that little boy. The probability of paternity is exactly 0%. I am not the father. And as Audra just brilliantly demonstrated to all of you, Nathaniel was physically incapable of being the father. Harrison's face was rapidly contorting from aggressive anger into absolute bewildered confusion. He looked at the medical records still glowing brightly on the wall, and then looked at the genetic test in DeAndre's hand. But if neither of you are the biological father, Harrison stammered, his loud, booming voice suddenly reduced to a weak, confused stutter. Then who is? DeAndre let out a cold, harsh laugh that lacked any genuine humor. That is the exact multi-million-dollar question, Harrison. Your sweet, innocent daughter did not just have a tragic momentary lapse in judgment. She engaged in a calculated, reckless affair, and when she inevitably got pregnant, she actively searched for the wealthiest, most convenient victim to permanently stick with the massive financial bill. She used me as her temporary safety net. Then she tried to use a dead man as her ultimate golden lottery ticket. Sierra suddenly dropped to her knees beside the glass table. She buried her face in her manicured hands and began to produce loud, dramatic, sobbing noises. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to reclaim the sympathy of the room. She was trying to deploy the exact same weapon she had successfully used to manipulate her thousands of internet followers into donating money to her fraudulent campaign. Stop crying, DeAndre commanded, his voice cracking like a heavy whip across the quiet room. Nobody in this room is ever going to believe your pathetic, fake tears again. Every single dollar you funneled out of my accounts to buy designer bags to wear in your little victim videos has been meticulously documented. My forensic accountant tracked every hidden credit card and every secret transfer. I am suing you for intentional infliction of emotional distress and massive financial restitution. I am going to legally garnish every single future paycheck you ever earn. You will spend the rest of your miserable life paying me back for the year you stole from me. He looked down at her, completely devoid of any remaining empathy. My legal team will officially serve those papers to you tomorrow morning. I am taking the car I paid for. I am keeping the house I paid for. I have already officially frozen all of our joint checking and savings accounts, so you cannot steal another single dime of my hard-earned money. You are walking out of this mansion tonight with absolutely nothing but the expensive designer clothes on your back. DeAndre stepped back from the table, firmly aligning himself directly beside me. We stood together, a completely united front against the utter destruction she had attempted to cause. Sierra remained on the floor, sobbing into her hands, but the wealthy elite audience she had desperately wanted to impress was looking at her with total unmasked disgust. Eleanor clutched her expensive pearl necklace, her eyes wide with total shock. But Bradley remained completely silent, completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the floor as the invisible walls of the trap began to rapidly close in entirely around him. DeAndre did not stop to admire his handiwork. He had successfully dismantled Sierra, but his absolute vengeance was only half complete. He turned his broad shoulders away from his sobbing wife and locked his intense gaze entirely on the velvet sectional. Bradley was still staring fixedly at the floor, completely frozen in a state of absolute terror. He looked like a cornered animal, suddenly realizing there was absolutely no escape from the slaughterhouse. DeAndre reached back into his tailored jacket pocket. He did not pull out another heavy legal binder. He pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of thick premium paper. It was the supplemental ancestry report from the genetic testing facility. He unfolded it with a sharp, crisp snap that made Bradley physically flinch in his seat. "I told you the official laboratory report confirmed that I have absolutely zero biological connection to that child." DeAndre stated, his voice lowering into a deadly calm register as he began to walk slowly across the living room. "But when I sent the swab to the facility, I paid for their premium global ancestry service. I wanted to know exactly what kind of genetic markers I was actually dealing with. I wanted to know the absolute truth without any shadow of a doubt." He stopped directly in front of the velvet sectional towering over the wealthy older man. Bradley was trembling visibly now. The arrogant, untouchable commercial real estate developer who commanded entire city blocks was physically shaking under the sheer weight of his impending doom. DeAndre looked down at Bradley, and then slowly, deliberately shifted his gaze to Eleanor. The elegant woman was still clutching her pearl necklace, her face a mask of polite, total confusion. She had absolutely no idea why this furious young man was suddenly standing directly in front of her husband holding a genetic report. DeAndre then turned his head to look directly at my father. Harrison was still breathing heavily, trying to process the agonizing fact that his perfect daughter was a total fraud, and his grand scheme to steal my $8 million estate was completely disintegrating. "You asked me a very specific question a minute ago," Harrison DeAndre said, keeping his voice perfectly even and dangerously cold. "You asked me who the real biological father of that little boy actually is. You wanted to know who Sierra was desperately trying to protect with all these elaborate, pathetic lies." DeAndre held the thick paper up, holding it out so the bold blue text of the familial match was clearly visible to the entire room. He did not hand it to my father. He just held it up like a massive execution blade waiting to finally drop. "If you truly want to know who the real father is," DeAndre announced, his voice echoing with devastating clarity, "you do not need to look very far. Ask the man who has been playing golf with you at the country club every single Sunday for the last 5 years. Ask the man sitting right in front of you." The silence that instantly swallowed the room was so profound it felt like all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the mansion. The words hung heavily in the air, absolutely refusing to be misunderstood or denied. Harrison blinked rapidly, his thick brow furrowing, as his brain desperately tried to reject the horrifying information. He looked at DeAndre and then slowly turned his head to look down at his best friend. Eleanor reacted first. The polite confusion completely vanished from her elegant face, replaced by a sudden, horrifying realization. She looked at the paper in DeAndre's hand and then turned to look directly at her husband of 30 years. Bradley's face was entirely, completely drained of color. He looked absolutely nauseous. He did not defend himself. He did not immediately shout that DeAndre was a vicious liar. He simply squeezed his eyes shut and hung his head in absolute terrifying shame. "Bradley." Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with a volatile mixture of profound shock and rising devastation. "Bradley, look at me right now. Tell me this is a ridiculous lie. Tell me you did not sleep with Harrison's daughter." Bradley opened his mouth, but he could not produce a single defensive word. He just shook his head slowly, offering a pathetic, silent confirmation of his absolute, undeniable guilt. Eleanor let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. It was a raw, visceral sound of 30 years of total devotion being violently shattered in a single second. She raised her right hand and slapped Bradley directly across the face with absolutely everything she had. The sharp, brutal crack of her palm hitting his cheek echoed like a gunshot through the massive living room. Bradley's head snapped violently to the side, a bright red handprint instantly blooming across his pale skin. "You absolute disgusting monster!" Eleanor shrieked, standing up so fast she nearly knocked over the glass coffee table. You slept with a woman half your age. You brought a child into this world, and you let her destroy other people to hide your filthy, selfish secret. While Eleanor screamed, Harrison finally fully processed the dark reality of the situation. The massive, untouchable ego of my father completely shattered into a million pieces. He realized in that exact agonizing second that he had been played for an absolute fool. His wealthy best friend, the man he admired and constantly tried to impress, had been secretly sleeping with his daughter. Worse, Bradley had sat silently by and watched Harrison make a total idiot of himself, trying to aggressively steal an $8 million house from his other daughter just to cover up Bradley's own disgusting mess. A terrifying animalistic growl ripped out of Harrison's throat. He did not say a single coherent word. He lunged directly across the coffee table, throwing his heavy frame entirely at Bradley. He grabbed the lapels of Bradley's expensive charcoal suit and violently hauled the older man completely off the velvet sectional. Bradley stumbled forward, crying out in sudden panic, but Harrison was entirely blinded by sheer humiliating rage. He slammed Bradley hard against the black marble fireplace, knocking the wind completely out of him. "You arrogant piece of trash!" Harrison roared, pulling Bradley back and slamming him against the cold marble a second time. "I let you into my home. I completely trusted you. You ruined my family. You made an absolute fool out of me in front of everyone." The pristine living room instantly erupted into absolute total chaos. DeAndre took a very deliberate step backward, completely removing himself from the physical violence he had just brilliantly ignited. He casually crossed his arms and watched the destruction with a look of pure, cold satisfaction. Eleanor was screaming for Harrison to let go of her husband, but she made absolutely no physical attempt to actually stop the brutal beating. Sierra was still on the floor, wailing uncontrollably, her perfectly manicured hands covering her face as her father violently assaulted the wealthy father of her child. Brenda let out a high-pitched hysterical shriek. The flawless high society image she valued above absolutely everything else in her entire life was currently being physically beaten to death against my fireplace. She took 2 uncoordinated steps backward and completely collapsed onto the adjacent velvet sofa. She clutched her chest as she dissolved into a puddle of uncontrollable hyperventilating hysterics, entirely incapable of handling the absolute destruction of her carefully curated reality. I stood perfectly still, watching the incredible physical carnage unfold in my flawless living room. I did not call for my security team. I did not verbally intervene. I simply watched my toxic family completely tear themselves to shreds, knowing that the absolute worst was still yet to come. The violent struggle against the black marble fireplace finally broke when Eleanor let out an absolutely ear-piercing scream. She was not screaming to protect the husband who had just shattered her entire 30-year marriage. She was screaming because the bright red blood from Bradley's busted lip was beginning to violently splatter onto my pristine white imported rug. Harrison froze mid-punch, his heavy chest heaving, as he suddenly realized he was actively committing a brutal physical assault in front of multiple high society witnesses. He released his tight grip on Bradley's ruined charcoal suit and stepped back heavily, wiping a thick bead of cold sweat from his forehead. Bradley instantly slumped sideways, sliding pathetically down the cold marble wall until he hit the hardwood floor, gasping desperately for air like a dying fish. Harrison turned around, his face still flushed a dangerous shade of purple. He looked frantically at the total destruction he had just caused. His incredibly wealthy best friend was bleeding on my floor. His elegant wife Brenda was practically hyperventilating on the velvet sofa, her manicured hands clutching her chest as if she were suffering a massive cardiac event. And his golden child, his perfect innocent daughter, was currently crawling across the floor like a desperate injured animal. Sierra had entirely abandoned her fake performative crying. Total, unadulterated panic had completely taken over her entire body. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive cocktail dress bunching up awkwardly around her thighs. She reached out and violently grabbed the sharp crease of DeAndre tailored suit pants. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug desperately into the expensive dark fabric. "DeAndre, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot leave me with absolutely nothing. I am the mother of a small child. I have endless bills to pay. We can just quietly go to marriage counseling. I will completely delete all my social media accounts. I will do whatever you want, but you cannot freeze my bank accounts and throw me out into the street tonight." DeAndre did not look down at her with a single ounce of pity. He looked at her exactly the way a person looks at a disgusting insect they just found crawling across their dinner plate. He smoothly stepped backward, physically ripping his pant leg directly out of her desperate grasp. "Do not ever touch me again. DeAndre stated, his voice echoing with cold, absolute finality. You are not a helpless victim, Sierra. You are a calculated predator who finally got caught in your own massive web of lies. You can ask your incredibly wealthy baby daddy over there bleeding on the floor to immediately pay off your massive credit card bills. I am entirely finished with you. Finished with. When DeAndre completely rejected her, Sierra immediately pivoted her desperate attention directly toward me. She scrambled across the floor until she was kneeling right at my feet. Her flawless makeup was entirely ruined, her expensive mascara running in dark, ugly streaks down her pale cheeks. Audra, please, she sobbed, staring up at me with wild, frantic eyes. Please, just let this all go. Just sign the settlement papers on the table so we can all leave this horrible house. If you just give me the estate, I can quietly sell it and use the massive cash payout to move far away and start over. I will never bother you again. Please, Audra, you are my older sister. You are supposed to protect me from things like this. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her request actually made me laugh out loud. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed loudly in the cavernous living room. She had spent an entire week viciously attempting to destroy my entire life and steal my home, and her absolute best defense was to beg me to just let her succeed so she could escape her own devastating consequences. Before I could even respond to her pathetic pleading, Harrison aggressively marched across the room and inserted himself directly into the conversation. His massive ego was desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of control he could possibly find in this chaotic nightmare. He pointed a thick, demanding finger directly at my face, completely ignoring his own horrific behavior. You have completely humiliated this family enough for one night. Audra Harrison yelled, his loud, booming voice, attempting to mask his underlying terror. You set this vicious trap to destroy my reputation and ruin my daughter. I demand that you stop this ridiculous charade right now. Sign that damn deed transfer so we can get out of this horrible place and quietly handle this disgusting Bradley situation privately behind closed doors. You owe this family your complete cooperation. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, aggressive energy. I simply offered him a slow, terrifyingly calm smile. I do not owe this family absolutely anything, I replied, my voice dropping into a deadly whisper that instantly silenced the entire room. But since you are so incredibly eager to finalize the paperwork, Harrison, let us take a very close look at that legal document you brought into my home. I calmly walked past my kneeling sister and stepped directly up to the flawless glass coffee table. I completely ignored the flimsy manila folder containing their forged will. Instead, I reached into the hidden drawer built seamlessly into the sleek media console. I pulled out a heavy black leather binder and walked back to the coffee table, dropping it heavily right next to Sierra-forged documents. The loud thud made Harrison physically flinch. Those are official corporate incorporation papers, I announced, tapping the thick leather cover with my index finger. I finalized them exactly 3 years ago when I first started aggressively expanding my luxury interior design business portfolio across the entire state. I flipped the heavy binder open, exposing the massive stack of dense legal documents heavily stamped by the State Corporate Commission. I turned the binder around so Harrison could clearly read the bold black text printed on the very first page. You see, Harrison, you and Sierra made a massive catastrophic assumption, I explained, my voice echoing with pure, undeniable triumph. You assumed that because Nathaniel and I lived in this massive $8 million mansion, that his name was actually on the property deed. You assumed you could easily use a cheap, horribly photoshopped, forged will to legally force a transfer of his personal assets to his fake biological child. Harrison stared down at the corporate documents, his face rapidly turning the color of wet cement. His eyes darted frantically across the legal text, desperately trying to find a loophole that absolutely did not exist. But Nathaniel was never on the deed. I continued driving the final devastating nail directly into their coffin. This property does not belong to me, and it certainly never belonged to my late husband. This house and the land it sits on belong entirely to Aura Staging, LLC. It is a completely shielded corporate asset, entirely immune to any personal probate claims or fake inheritance demands. I leaned forward, resting both of my hands firmly on the glass table, completely trapping my father in my intense, unwavering gaze. You did not just create a fake document, Harrison, I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute venom. You committed aggressive felony forgery and attempted massive corporate extortion to steal a house from a dead man who did not even own it. And because you explicitly submitted that heavily forged document to a federal probate judge yesterday morning, you have officially crossed the line from a pathetic family dispute directly into a massive federal crime. The heavy silence following my revelation was absolute. Harrison stood completely paralyzed over the glass coffee table, his brain short-circuiting as the severe reality of a federal crime finally crashed down upon his massive ego. He opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic lie, but before a single word could escape his lips, a sharp, piercing wail shattered the quiet atmosphere of the mansion. It was not another one of Sierra's fake theatrical sobs. It was the aggressive, unmistakable scream of multiple police sirens rapidly echoing up the long private driveway. Red and blue emergency lights instantly flooded through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, violently washing the dark modern living room in a chaotic strobe of harsh colors. The flashing lights illuminated the absolute terror permanently frozen on my father's face. Brenda immediately stopped her pathetic hyperventilating on the velvet sofa and sat bolt upright, her manicured hands gripping the expensive fabric as if she were bracing for a massive earthquake. Bradley remained slumped on the floor against the black marble fireplace, clutching his bleeding lip and staring blankly at the flashing lights outside. "You did not honestly think I would let you walk into my home and attempt to extort me without severe legal consequences, did you?" I asked, calmly crossing my arms. "While you were busy putting on your fake little performance about family blood and forgiveness, my corporate legal team was actively sitting in the district attorney office. They handed over the high-definition security footage of you aggressively threatening me in this exact room yesterday. They handed over the certified medical records, the undeniable DNA test, and the absolute undeniable proof that your supposedly legal will was horribly forged using a cheap internet template and a stolen signature." The heavy brass knocker on the front double doors echoed violently through the grand foyer, demanding immediate entry. DeAndre did not wait for a second knock. He turned his back on the pathetic scene in the living room and marched straight to the entryway, throwing the massive oak doors wide open. 6 heavily armed, uniformed police officers and a stern lead detective immediately flooded into my home, their heavy boots stomping aggressively across the polished hardwood floors. The detective did not ask for permission to enter the living room. He marched directly toward the center of the chaos, his hand resting firmly on his heavy-duty belt. Sierra instantly scrambled backward across the expensive white rug, frantically trying to put as much physical distance between herself and the approaching officers as humanly possible. She looked absolutely feral, her designer cocktail dress twisted and stained, her flawless makeup completely destroyed by her genuine terrified tears. Sierra and Harrison, the lead detective, announced, his deep voice projecting absolute, unquestionable authority across the large space. "You are both being officially placed under immediate arrest. The district attorney has already fast-tracked the warrants. You are being charged with severe felony forgery, attempted grand financial fraud, and massive corporate extortion." "Absolutely not!" Brenda shrieked, finally finding her voice as she launched herself off the velvet sofa. "You cannot arrest them. We are highly respected members of the country club. This is a massive misunderstanding. My daughter is a totally innocent victim of a vicious corporate misunderstanding." The detective completely ignored my mother, hysterical shrieking. He gestured sharply to 2 of the uniform officers, who immediately lunged forward and forcefully grabbed Sierra by her arms. She let out a wild, ear-piercing scream, kicking her expensive designer heels wildly into the air as they physically hoisted her completely off the floor. "Get your hands off of me!" Sierra violently shrieked, thrashing her entire body side to side like a captured wild animal. "Daddy, do something. Do not let them take me to jail. I cannot go to jail. Daddy, please tell them it was entirely your idea. You forced me to do it." Harrison did not move a single muscle to protect his precious golden child. When 2 other large officers aggressively grabbed his arms and forcefully shoved him face first against the massive smart television, he completely surrendered. The harsh, bright screen still displaying Nathaniel medical records illuminated Harrison's face as the officers violently yanked his arms behind his back. The loud, sharp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around my father's wrists was the single most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Sierra continued to scream and violently thrash as the officers forcefully dragged her out of the living room and toward the front doors. Her expensive heels scraped aggressively across the polished hardwood, leaving long, dark marks on the pristine floor. Her desperate, pathetic pleas for someone to save her echoed loudly down the street, completely shattering the quiet, wealthy neighborhood, until the heavy doors of the police cruiser violently slammed shut, entirely cutting off her pathetic voice. The detective read Harrison his official Miranda rights in a bored, monotone voice, before forcefully marching my defeated, humiliated father out the front door. Brenda attempted to follow them, still loudly shrieking about calling their expensive country club lawyers, but one of the officers firmly ordered her to remain exactly where she was until the entire scene was properly secured. With Sierra and Harrison successfully loaded into the back of the flashing police cruisers, the chaotic energy in the massive living room suddenly vanished, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic smoking ruins of my completely destroyed family. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded as the heavy vehicles aggressively pulled away from my driveway, driving the absolute worst people in my life directly to a cold concrete holding cell. I turned my full attention to the remaining trash still lingering in my flawless home. Bradley was still slumped entirely against the fireplace, his expensive suit covered in his own blood, and his massive untouchable reputation completely obliterated. Eleanor slowly stood up from the velvet sectional. She completely ignored my mother, who was softly sobbing into her hands. She walked deliberately over to her bleeding husband and stared down at him with eyes as cold and hard as solid diamonds. Eleanor reached down and violently grabbed Bradley's left hand. She did not offer to help him stand. Instead, she forcefully ripped the heavy gold wedding band directly off his finger. She threw the heavy ring directly onto his chest, letting it bounce off his expensive bloody suit and roll uselessly onto the floor. "Do not even bother trying to return to our house tonight," Eleanor stated, her voice perfectly steady and dripping with pure absolute venom. "My security team will immediately throw your expensive belongings onto the front lawn. You will hear from my divorce attorneys first thing tomorrow morning. And believe me, Bradley, I am going to completely ruin you." Eleanor turned her back on him completely and walked out of my house with her head held incredibly high, maintaining her flawless high society grace, even in the absolute center of a total nightmare. I looked down at Bradley and then shifted my gaze to my mother, who was still shaking uncontrollably on the sofa. They were completely stripped of their massive egos, their fake wealth, and their pathetic manufactured illusions. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. "Get out of my house," I commanded, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. Bradley slowly scrambled to his feet, holding his bleeding lip, and practically ran out the front door, desperate to escape the utter destruction he had actively participated in. Brenda slowly stood up, clutching her expensive designer handbag like a useless shield. She looked around the massive, beautiful room, realizing she would never again set foot in my luxurious life. Her reputation was permanently destroyed. Her husband and golden child were currently sitting in the back of a police car facing decades in federal prison. Her entire social standing was completely obliterated. She walked out into the cold, dark night entirely alone, leaving me standing completely victorious in the absolute center of my flawless, heavily protected fortress. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the toxic waste of my past outside my fortress forever. The massive, complex legal system moved with a brutal, ruthless efficiency that completely destroyed whatever pathetic illusions my arrogant family still harbored. Sierra did not get her dramatic, highly publicized trial, where she could continuously manipulate a sympathetic jury with her fake internet tears. The aggressive federal prosecutors offered her high-priced defense attorney a massive mountain of undeniable evidence, including the high-definition extortion tape and the heavily documented digital forgery trail. Faced with the terrifying concrete reality of a massive 20-year federal sentence in a maximum security facility, she immediately shattered and took a miserable, restrictive plea deal. She was permanently stripped of her internet access, her expensive designer wardrobe, and her fake helpless widow persona. The federal judge handed down a solid 5-year sentence in a minimum security federal prison. She was officially a convicted felon, and the massive viral internet community she had relentlessly manipulated completely turned on her, tearing her digital reputation to absolute shreds in a matter of hours. Harrison did not fare any better in the chaotic aftermath. The massive federal charges completely annihilated his fragile standing in the wealthy elite business community. But the absolute final killing blow did not even come from the aggressive district attorney. It came directly from Bradley. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to hide his massive wealth from Eleanor during their brutal, highly publicized divorce proceedings, Bradley completely liquidated his massive commercial investment portfolio. He ruthlessly pulled every single dime of his commercial funding out of my father's massive real estate ventures overnight. Without Bradley, massive financial backing, Harrison's entire fragile house of cards instantly collapsed under a mountain of aggressive debt. My parents were completely bankrupt within exactly 30 days. The massive commercial bank rapidly foreclosed on their lavish country club estate. Their expensive imported cars were rapidly repossessed, and their elite wealthy friends completely abandoned them. Brenda and Harrison were unceremoniously forced to move into a tiny rundown two-bedroom apartment on the absolute wrong side of the city, with peeling paint and constantly loud neighbors. I permanently blocked their phone numbers, instructed my high-end private security team to heavily monitor the perimeter of my estate, and completely erase their pathetic, miserable existence from my entire successful life. DeAndre executed his massive legal retaliation with the exact same cold surgical precision. His high-priced, aggressive divorce attorneys absolutely decimated Sierra in family court. Because she was a convicted felon currently serving hard time in federal prison, the judge immediately granted DeAndre full, absolute legal control over all their financial assets. But DeAndre proved exactly why he was a fundamentally good man who simply got caught in a massive web of evil, calculated lies. He did not ruthlessly abandon the innocent little boy who had been violently weaponized in this massive, disgusting scheme. Recognizing that Bradley wanted absolutely nothing to do with his secret biological child, and knowing Sierra was completely legally unfit to be a mother, DeAndre officially filed for partial legal guardianship. He established a heavily protected trust fund and hired a highly vetted full-time professional nanny to ensure the little boy received a genuinely good life, completely far away from the toxic radioactive fallout of my completely destroyed family. He completely, legally cut Sierra out of the child life, guaranteeing she could never use the boy as a financial pawn ever again. Exactly 1 month after the massive explosive confrontation in my pristine living room, DeAndre returned to my quiet, heavily guarded estate. The massive aggressive media circus had finally died down, and the quiet, peaceful energy had fully returned to my flawless modern home. He stood in the center of my massive kitchen holding 2 expensive crystal glasses. I reached into my massive climate-controlled wine cellar and pulled out the absolute most expensive bottle of vintage champagne I owned. We did not throw a massive, loud, obnoxious party. We did not gloat endlessly over the absolute total destruction of our massive mutual enemies. We simply stood together in the quiet, beautiful kitchen, bonded by a deep, profound mutual respect, forged in the absolute darkest fires of betrayal. DeAndre slowly raised his crystal glass and gently tapped it against mine. We shared a quiet, honorable toast to Nathaniel, honoring a genuinely good man who had absolutely protected me from beyond the grave. We drank the expensive, crisp champagne in comfortable silence, completely free from the suffocating weight of the massive toxic parasites who had aggressively tried to consume our entire lives. I stepped out through the massive sliding glass doors onto my pristine private balcony. The cool evening breeze gently wrapped around my shoulders as I looked out over the massive, glittering skyline of the city. My $8 million estate was completely silent, deeply peaceful, and absolutely, entirely mine. The heavy, suffocating dark clouds of manipulation and toxic family obligation were permanently gone, completely replaced by a vast, endless sky of total, undeniable freedom.